outcome is a particular kind of result. And in my work, I've found that it's really, really helpful to be really specific about what we mean when we say an outcome. An outcome is a change in human behavior that creates value.
All right. Hey, everybody. Today we are talking about one of my favorite topics. And I don't know, Josh, if you knew it was one of my favorite topics, but we're talking about outcomes over outputs. And I have the wonderful pleasure of talking with Josh Seiden today. Josh and I go way back, and he is many things, a wonderful human being, and a designer, a product person, an author, a coach. He works with teams to help them design and deliver products that people actually value, actually love, companies of all sizes, right? Not only with things about outcomes and outputs, but general culture, practices, and processes to help us all be our best. He is the author of the book, Outcomes Over Output, which we are going to focus on today. Also co-author with Jeff Gothelf with the book Sense and Respond and Lean UX, two excellent books that are also near and dear to my heart. So we're going to get into kind of like the mistakes that we all make when we try to really focus on outcomes versus outputs. But first, I know you've been talking about this for a long time, but tell us briefly what is so important. What is this idea of outcomes over outputs? What and why it's so important?
Yeah, well, the fundamental idea is that you can make stuff, right? Like, making technology, it's hard. We spend a lot of time making stuff, and it's hard to make stuff. That the stuff that we make for this conversation, we'll call that output. You can make stuff that you think is going to deliver value, but it may not deliver value, right? It may be hard to use. People may not even want it. People may not use it. And so what's the point of making stuff that nobody uses or nobody values, right? And so what we want to make stuff that people value. And so we call that value an outcome. And so the idea is like, let's really think about what are the things that people value? What are the outcomes that we're trying to get? And then work backwards to get to the output that we need to make.
Okay, so outputs are still in the equation, but they have to follow the outcome that we want to produce.
Yeah, I think one of the funny things that I never expected. So the book is called Outcomes Over Outputs, and people think that somehow I think that we shouldn't be making outputs, that outputs are evil in some way, and it's like, no, it's not. The book isn't called Outcomes, not outputs.
Right.
It's outcomes over outputs. Like, let's just think about the outcomes first, right? You still actually have to make stuff, and you have to be good at making stuff, and you have to make good stuff. But like, all of that is in the service of this higher order thing, which is the outcome.
Yeah, I think that's so important because that people are very good at latching on to one thing. Oh, I get it. Outcomes, outcomes, outcomes. And then they focus on that and minimize the importance of outputs, which are still important. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And I've seen that in my own work as well. So where do we get it wrong, right? When people listen to the Scaling Tech podcast, I'm talking to folks like yourself, and I really want folks to tune in when they're like, all right, I've tried this methodology. I've tried to focus on outcomes, but I just get stuck. And I think right now, today, outcomes and the idea of building things that are of value is so important, more so than a year ago. The name of the game this year is efficiency, right? And really kind of making sure that you are as high functioning as possible with your technology team. And I think this focus on outcomes is a key linchpin in that equation. So,
Yeah.
so where do we get tripped up? What's like, let's start with one. You had mentioned, and I want to kind of drill into this, not actually changing the way that we work. So tell me about that.
Yeah. So I mean, I think, so outcomes, outcomes is a way, the technique of declaring the outcomes we're trying to achieve. We should probably start with like the definition of outcome that we're going to talk about, because I think one of the mistakes is that people use the word outcome to just mean results, right?
Okay.
And so outcomes, and like outcome is a particular kind of result. And in my work, I've found that it's really, really helpful to be really specific about what we mean when we say an outcome. An outcome is a change in human behavior that creates value,
Okay.
right? So it's something that a user does differently, something that a customer does differently, or something that someone inside my organization does differently that creates value for the user, the customer, the business.
When you say
And
does differently, that could be as simple as placing an order.
yeah, right. So people
Okay.
place orders today at 5% of everything that people put in the cart actually converts.
Ah, okay.
Right? People put things in the shopping cart. I'm making this number up. People put something in a shopping cart on our e-commerce site, but only 5% of those people check out.
Yeah.
Could we, over the next quarter, increase the checkout rate to 7%,
Right.
to
Right.
10%,
Got it.
to 25%? So that's a change in customer behavior, right? That
Yeah.
we're targeting. And that so that is really a very different definition of our work than saying we're gonna change the size and color and position of the checkout button, right? Changing the size and position and color of the checkout button is output. We're going to make something. It might work, like it'll work from a functioning software point of view, but will it work to deliver value? We don't know. Maybe the problem has nothing to do with the button size, shape, and position. Maybe the problem is, I don't know, the shipping prices, or maybe the problem is something else. I don't know. And so it, the first thing that happens is that we want to be really, really precise. So you were asking me about mistakes. First thing is we want to be really precise about what we mean when we say an outcome. Okay, team, your job is to increase checkout rate of, or reduce abandonment or whatever that
Mhm.
is. The second mistake, though, is actually taking that seriously. Actually changing the way we work. What does it mean, right? Like you see that all the time with OKRs, right?
Right. Right.
They spend all this time in the beginning of the year and they write OKRs. And then they're just like, yeah, okay, whatever, business as usual,
Mm.
right? As opposed to saying, well, actually, what do we need to do to increase the checkout rate in the cart? Do we know why people are abandoning at a high rate? We should go find that out before we just go ahead with, oh, we've got all this work in the backlog to change the size and position and color of the checkout button, right? We should actually do some discovery, and that might be a different way of working, right? To actually build product discovery into our process, right?
Yeah.
Or to approach the problem cross-functionally and say, well, maybe it's not actually a product problem. Maybe it's the way we're marketing our services, or the way we're pricing our products, or the way we're incentivizing or fulfilling or whatever, right? And so to really kind of think about outcomes seriously is to say, well, actually, to ask that question, what do we need to do to deliver this outcome, and what do we need to change in the way we approach the work?
And then obviously you don't know if you're right. Right. I mean, it's when when you're trying to figure out how to change the way we work to deliver the outcome, you may be right or you may be wrong, or you may
Yeah.
be less right than you thought you were. Right. There's all sorts of shades of gray in there. Oh, if we do this
Right.
thing in a double X, but you might only increase X by 10%, right? And so I think this is where we loop in the iterative nature of this, right? We define what we want to change to deliver the value, and then we also have to iterate on it, right? As we're learning more and moving towards the future. Okay, well, we thought it was going to double it. It's 10%. So we have to then go back and say, well, what else do we want to change, or what do we want to change different, right? And this idea of just because you think you have a hypothesis, you might not be right,
That's right. That's
right?
right. And yeah, and that's such a critical component, that being able to iterate and being willing to iterate, right? So, and a lot of teams, like a lot of teams are measured, their performance is measured by velocity, right? How
Mhm.
many
Right.
stories do we push through this system? And to have to go back, it breeds kind of a culture that hates rework,
Hmm.
right? And it's
Yeah.
like, well, we already fixed the cart, Josh. Why do
Yeah.
we have to fix the cart again?
Right.
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 Well, right. And so, the if the mandate is over the next quarter, we're going to raise the checkout rate from 5% to 25. And in our first sprint, we push something out there and then we measure it for a couple of weeks and it's good but not great. We want to be able to take another crack at it
Right.
and another crack at it. And we want to keep taking those cracks at it through the whole quarter. And we want to keep updating and being transparent about our progress and what's working and what's not working. And that's a very different conversation than saying, oh, here's our velocity for this quarter, right? Your
Right.
velocity is probably, I mean, depending on how you think about it, but the number of features, the number of new features you work on is not going to be the measure. It's going to be the effectiveness of those features, and that may mean that you need to work on them over and over again.
And I think one mistake, or one roadblock rather than a mistake, one roadblock that I see teams run into here is you run into, if the second you align yourself with business value, which is an outcome, the second then you are now in this conversation with stakeholders that sometimes have a different level of agile fluency than the team building the feature, right? Not always, but most of the time, right? The stakeholders have like a lower level of, not always, but a lower level of agile fluency than the team building towards the outcomes. And then this idea of having that autonomy and that comfort to iterate, while also, kind of managing up. I think we get it's not necessarily a mistake, but it's we get stuck with this. Oh, we're agile, we're iterating, we know that we're going to look every 2 weeks and see how we're doing, but there might be these external factors driving us towards a different, outputs instead of outcomes. Like, get it done by
Yeah,
this date. The card
right,
must be released by this date. I don't care if it works or not. I just
right,
need it.
right.
And again, I'm overgeneralizing for the sake of making a point, but how do we get around, like, how do we communicate the value of the outcomes and iterating towards them once
Right.
we have to come in reality with the other folks at our
Yeah.
organization.
I think we're used to a conversation, and we've built a conversation with stakeholders that is built around kind of features and milestones, right? We're going to have this feature
Right.
on this date,
Right.
right? And if it's going slowly, then we've trained our stakeholders with this concept of like, look how fast we're going, look at our velocity.
Right.
There's
Right.
just a lot of work here in the queue, right? And so, we're getting on this feature, we're doing this feature, we're getting it by this date, our velocity is this good. And that conversation really has nothing to do with, are we achieving outcomes,
Hmm.
right? And so, like, um, it's not that conversation is useless. It's that there's a different conversation that we have to have along with it. And so the different conversation is, okay, stakeholders, we've agreed that our target for the quarter is this 25% number. Now, we're going to keep you posted on our progress every week. And that progress is, oh, look, we put this thing out. We think it's going to bump our numbers. Oh, look at the numbers we've got this week. We've grown by 2%. That's not good enough. We're going to keep going. Oh, look at this. We've grown by 10%. That's great, but it's not what we said we were going to do, so we're going to keep going. Oh, we made this change and we actually regressed. Whoops. Right? And so there's a kind of, you have to keep this line of communication open to demonstrate the fact that you're actually navigating through this unknown, right? This sort of this territory where we don't know the answers, but look at how good our team is at finding the answers.
Right.
And that's the story that we want to be telling. Look at how good we are at finding the answers rather than look at how good we are at building stuff, which
right.
is
And this,
important, but
and this goes to, I think, a thing that trips people up, which is that conversation around how we prioritize and commit to work, right? And
Mhm.
uh, it's not that the conversation needs to be different. It just needs to be, or it ought to be, in addition, right? Because there are external factors of the team, of the product, of the organization, right? Things in the marketplace might change, things in the industry might change. All that being said, it is that continuous look into progress towards the value that the team is committing to, right? And I think this goes back to, um, over the last 10 years, there's this ongoing debate of, what are agile teams committing to stakeholders? Are we committing estimates? Are we committing throughput? What are we committing? And this idea of, we agreed that this goal of 25%, from 5% is what we're marching towards. And, we might get to a point where 10% is good enough, or not good enough for the next 6 months, but might then become second priority to something else. Right. And so it's an evolving, ongoing conversation, but we always have to think about the outcomes that we're driving towards.
yeah,
Right. And so
yeah.
um, how do we make sure that we are committing to the right work,
Mm.
or as close to possible? Is
Yeah, I mean,
that
you know,
possible?
I think that, well, okay, so I guess one thing I should say here, and maybe this is, and I'm not exactly answering your question, but I'm going to get to your question, I promise. But one thing I should say is that thinking about outcomes and prioritizing outcomes is really, really valuable. It's a really useful way of working when we don't know the answer,
Hmm.
right?
Okay.
Like when we're trying to do something and we don't exactly know how to do it. Like checkout rates are at 5% and we need to grow them to 25%. We don't know how to do it,
Yeah.
right? But there's other categories of technology work that we just have to do,
Right.
right? You gotta, okay, we're gonna move from this data center to that data center. Okay. But we can talk about some outcomes in that scenario too. But like, or we have to, there's this new regulation and we have to do this work to comply with the regulation. Like there's very little uncertainty there. And in
Right.
those kinds of scenarios, like being kind of feature based can be okay, right? So committing to work and saying like, we're gonna, we're gonna turn off the old data center on this date. So we have the new data center fully operational on this
Hmm.
date, minus X, so that we can do whatever we need to do. Like that's there's certain kinds of work that it's fine. But for work where we really don't know the answer, right? That's actually an important piece of the conversation with our stakeholders. So if this, stakeholders are saying, well, we need you to rebuild the shopping cart. Okay, why? Why are we
Right.
rebuilding the
Right.
shopping cart? Like we
Right.
could do that, but why are we doing it? Like how will we know when we've rebuilt it correctly? Right? And the answer isn't that we need to rebuild. Actually, we do most of the time in those scenarios, we don't need to rebuild the shopping cart, right? What we want is, oh, well, we've got a problem with the checkout rates here. We've got high
Hmm.
abandonment rates, low checkout rates. That's the problem that we want to be working on. And so in those situations, like being able to have that conversation that transforms the contract that we're making with our stakeholders,
Hmm.
whether that's a formal contract in a consulting situation or an informal contract internally,
Hmm.
we want to be talking about the uncertainty. We want to be talking about the problem, and outcomes give us a way to do that, right? And so that conversation should start when the initiative is chartered, right? And it's all about saying, well, like, what is the uncertainty here, right? And how will we monitor our progress?
Right. And so really make sure that literally ask the question, what is the uncertainty here? Because even if there is no uncertainty, then you'll draw, oh, there. there's very little uncertainty here, right? And so it would be confirming to hear that. And if there is uncertainty, even if we can't quantify how big that uncertainty is, the fact that we understand that we're going into uncharted territory is really important to have at the start of, like you said, the formal or the informal contract. So I think that's key, right? And then and then what happens, I've seen this happen, I'm sure you've seen this happen, is um the people move fast these days, and someone in their head has connected a bunch of dots and said, I need you to rebuild the shopping cart. And then if we're thinking about outcomes, we might start with, okay, what's the uncertainty here? Uncover that it's really kind of percentage of people converting into buyers, into customers. And then you follow up with the question of, well, what would you say if I can increase that percentage without redoing the shopping cart? Is that still the outcome that you're looking for? Right? It's almost like kind of teasing apart, like, okay, is this what you think needs to happen? And what if we can make your outcome happen without doing the out, right? Like almost kind of
Right.
challenging folks to kind of pull apart those two things, I think is really a key way to unblock us from focusing on the work versus the results, like you said at the beginning. Does that make am I on track or am I off?
Perfectly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Jeff Patton, my friend Jeff, who is, I think, just always really, really clear about this. Jeff Patton says that our goal is always to achieve the maximum outcome with the smallest amount of output possible. Right. So how do you make sure that the scale, you're doing the tiniest amount of work to achieve the maximum result? And so I think, different stakeholders, listen, I've rarely met a stakeholder who will talk to you about their uncertainty, right? leaders get to a place of leadership by, projecting an image of certainty. And so if you ask them, are you certain? They're like, hell yeah, I'm certain. What are you talking to me about? But so
I've been known to say that. Yeah, I've been known to say that myself.
Yeah, right. Of course I'm certain. I'm certain. I figured it all out in the shower this morning. But I think talking to, like, some kinds of stakeholders will be really, really interested in talking to you about risk, right? And so uncertainty is really like, it's right, that you can talk about it that way. Like, what could go wrong? What are the things that we don't know here that could cause this project to fail? And so that's one way to talk about the uncertainty. But the other way is to talk about it in terms of exactly what you're saying. What if there was a way to do this same thing, get this benefit with less? Right? Could we do it with less? We had a client. I had a client that I worked for 8+ years ago now, and they were not a big budget client. They were a small organization, and they were trying to build a new digital marketplace. And they had built out a really big list of requirements for this two-sided web-based marketplace.
Okay.
And it was like whatever. The details of it are not super important for this story, but we came to them and we said, how will you know that marketplace is working? And they said, well, we've got this many of this side of the market on the marketplace. We've got this many of this side of the marketplace. And we've made this many transactions by this date. They had a 6-month deadline. They had to get this marketplace up and running. And we said, well, if we could get all of those transactions happening without a web-based marketplace, would you be okay with that? And they said, well, no, we're coming to you because we need a web-based marketplace. And we're like, okay, good. So it has to be a web-based marketplace. Clear. Yeah. That's a minimum. Now, if we could do it without these features, would that be okay? And then we're like, oh yeah, if it works without that, fine.
Right.
And we said, if we could do it without this, would that be okay? And they're like, yeah, if we could do it without that, that would be fine. So in the conversation, we started to say, like, okay, what's the focus? The focus was onboarding like 1,000 of, I don't remember the number, but onboarding X amount of these people on one side of the marketplace, onboarding Y amount of these people, and transacting X number of transactions before those 6 months, and that was a super effective way to manage that project, and it really it helped us and the client be really scrupulous about their spend, because really they had a very limited budget, and
Right,
so
right.
none of us wanted to be spending time and building features that weren't going to deliver value for them. So
Right, right, absolutely. And that's a great story and a great way to kind of think about the framework for having the conversation, starting about risk, then diving into this idea of how how ought we might achieve the outcome through different paths, right, if you will, right? And so that's what I heard that you helped. That's kind of what I took away from that story. And so the one last question that's on my mind that I want to bring up is, um, 90% of the problems are people problems. So not only when it comes to outcomes, but other things as well. And so we've talked about changing the way we work. We've talked about how we talk about what we're committing to, and we've talked about building up those agile muscles. And the last thing I want to dig into is, how do we think about the way we organize our teams? Because the, this whole concept to me is kind of amorphous now that, a lot of people are on teams yet working remotely, and not everybody. I know some people are back in the office full time, some people are part time, but I think the concept of organizing teams is complicated by the fact that many teams aren't in person all the time anymore. And so how do we kind of make sure that we're organized in the either the optimal way or the good enough way to make sure that once we have all the best laid plans, we can actually, our organization isn't a roadblock. So how
right.
do we think about that?
I mean, I think one of the challenges, and this is a um, one of the challenges with outcomes is that we're changing what teams are responsible for, right?
Okay.
So, like, I think, if you think about it as one of the ways that it would be possible to organize a team would be to say, you all are responsible for this part of the website or this part of the product, this feature, this feature, this feature, this feature, this
Right.
feature, right? And so, I like the analogy would be like a car assembly line, right?
Right.
Like, you all are the tire people, and you all are the wheel people, and you all are the axle people, and you all put it all together, right? So you've got four teams there,
Yeah.
right? Um, but instead, like with outcomes, we're saying, okay, people are not checking out. Just to go back to this example we've been using this whole conversation, right? Checkout rate is low. Okay, but your team owns that problem. Okay, what do you work on? Is it the shopping cart? Is it the landing page where you tell people how great your shipping policies are? Right? Is it your product information page where people put things in the cart? Like, where's the problem, and how do you own that across a large product? That's not a obviously easy problem to solve, because we're giving people a mandate that might cut across lots of parts of our product. And so when we talk about organizing teams, we really need to think about, how do you organize a team that is responsible for a customer journey that might have responsibilities that touch lots of different pieces of the
Hmm.
product, and give them permission to go do that. And that's a challenge with the way we organize our teams, but it's also a challenge with the way we architect the product. And so you'll see teams that I've seen teams now that are working towards that are having these kind of two-tier organizational structures where teams are building. Some teams build kind of basic capabilities. The I saw, I don't know if they're still doing this, but I heard a presentation a few years ago from USAA, right? The bank, and they have a layer of teams that work on capabilities like credit checks or interest rate calculations or things like that. And then they have another layer of teams that are working on things like customer journeys, right? So you might have a mortgage team or a car loan team
Mm-hmm.
or a home refi team, and those are stringing those capabilities together. And so it, it, it's a non-trivial problem, right? But
Yeah.
it's definitely different from the way we organize teams today.
Right. I've heard you mentioned organizing teams around customer journeys. I've also heard, I think it's identical or maybe adjacent, organizing around value streams.
Yeah. I think it's a similar idea, I think.
Similar idea. And I think, one of the things I've seen present a real problem is when in bigger organizations, when part of the organization wants to organize in this way and other parts do not and will not. And then you're in this situation where I want to really solve this customer journey or this value stream, and I only can see 60% of it. The other 40%, I know it exists and it's thrown over to me when it's ready, but I can't see inside that box. And so I think, we don't have tons of time to dig into that thoroughly, but I'll kind of just zoom out and say, I think it's so critically important to really think about how you organize your teams, either good enough or ideally, so that you are mapping the pods, the scrum teams, the customer journey teams, however we want to call them, so that you are at a minimum not adding overhead. Like nothing is going to be perfect, and again, the bigger the company, I think the harder this is, right? Is like, you and I have both seen, oh, we're reorging into business units, we're reorging across, specialty, and then these big companies go through these reorgs, and it's painful, it's messy, and sometimes it's not possible at all, right? Sometimes it's just not feasible, but the takeaway is thinking about it and raising that question and trying to organize the teams around customer journeys. Like, would that get us part of the way there? Like, what else am I missing?
No, I don't think you're really missing anything. I just think that like at that point you've got like there are organizational problems that stand in the way of using any method you can name.
True.
Right.
True.
And this is like the thing you're talking about now. It's sort of like, well, it doesn't really have anything to do with outcomes. It doesn't really have anything to do with Agile. It doesn't really have anything to do with anything except like the organization's not aligned in their vision of what they're trying to do. And if you've got pieces of the organization fighting each other.
Got it. Got it.
Then,
no, that's a fair point. And so let's back up and kind of end where we started. Because I do think that organizational company organizational road, let me say that again. The way that companies organize themselves is a factor that could be a real, headwind, or it could be kind of like an asset, right? And it really kind of is important, and yet also it's off to the side. And so circling back, I think my biggest takeaway is outcomes are something that we've been talking about now for many years. They're more important now, I think, than ever. When the name of the game at company growth is efficient growth, the best way to get there is through focusing on outcomes. That really starts with identifying what behaviors you want to change in the way you work, making that work visible, and iterating towards the outcomes that you seek, whether or not you are certain or uncertain about them. And the more uncertainty there is, the more important an outcome-driven approach is. And then really kind of thinking about how we change the conversation around how we commit to the work that we're putting in and delivering. So That's kind of like the sum up for me. But what's your final thoughts on this? Like what takeaways
You
do you
should
have?
write a book about this, Debbie.
Maybe I will.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think you captured it really well. I think the for me one of the great missed opportunities in our industry. We spend a lot of time working on software that doesn't deliver any value. The opportunity cost of that is really high.
Yeah.
So to me, the question is how can we learn to get better at building stuff that delivers value. And I think that, there are a lot of ways you can think about that. But for me, I think having teams that can think about, identify, and then iterate their way towards these outcomes is a way of trying to capture back some of that opportunity cost.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Josh, it's been, as always, a pleasure. I appreciate your time and thank you so much.
Thank you, Debbie. Always great to talk to you.
All right. Take care.